Otay, 16 December. Welcome to Dis and Dat. We'll get back to our regular stuff in a moment, but I was going to talk today about capital switching. Uh, there's a switching and reswitching argument that David Harvey presents, and sort of related matters. Neil Smith's writings on uneven development are important. I've mentioned Neil before, the late Neil Smith, and there are certain things that I think become important. That is, how is it that we produce nature? What is the production of nature? I mean, do we produce nature? Do humans produce nature? That's an interesting question. It sort of is raised by the Capitalocene, whatever the arguments. Oh, damn it. Hello. Can you hear me?
Roger that.
All righty. I got a speaker warning or something. Anyway, the idea is that you could argue that we produce nature. That's controversial, but worth talking about. In some ways, that's how we can frame, for example, one of the older theories of development called dependency theory, and it shows how humans, as it were, conquer nature, how colonialism and imperialism operate to produce nature, so to speak. It's argued in a variety of places that that could occur. That's not as important as this idea that capital moves around or is switched. It's a David Harvey argument. To answer this and related questions, vital to understand at a systemic level the evolving connections between capital switching, fixed capital formation, a politics of socio-natures, and the broader architecture of capitalist hegemony. And so this Scott Prudhomme article provides some steps in that direction, and the companion piece to follow delves more specifically, et cetera, on metabolism and capital switching and sunk capital. But before we get to that, I put in an article that's slightly dated from 1994, but it introduces the topic, that is, of capital switching in the built environment, and covers about a 20-year period by, this is by R.A. Beauregard. And in this abstract, in this paper, a weak test of the capital switching argument developed by David Harvey is offered with data on construction investment activity for the USA and on various alternative investments. A temporal analysis was used to assess whether evidence exists for the movement of capital from the primary to the secondary circuit. The argument for this idea of, remember, we've talked about circuits of capital, kind of why we've been looking at volume 2 of Capital, because it's further identified there. David Harvey picks up on that, identifies primary, secondary, tertiary circuits. And Beauregard's paper is focused specifically on the building boom of the 1980s, as that expansion has been the focus of recent theoretical and empirical work centered on the relation between urbanization and the restructuring of capital. Little support was found for the claim that capital switching has occurred, but the data do point to a delinking of real estate investment from non-speculative investment criteria and use value considerations. Well, all of that means is that in 1994, this predates, of course, the where you could argue that capital switching was going on in the 2007-2008 financial crisis, where you know capital moved around a little bit. People started doing other things with investments and doing it in ways that weren't properly securitized, hence putting a lot of people in trouble, particularly on an international scale. So it's important. I mean, this sort of fits in the overall historiography of the case. If we're looking at David Harvey, we would look at, at what moment how does construction investment operate? And so Beauregard notes the theoretical components of the circuits of capital argument then are all in place in the 1975 paper, the relation of the built environment to the sphere of production and capital accumulation in that sphere, the mediation of financial institutions and the relative autonomy of the urbanization process and the cyclical nature of capitalist investments and thus the tendency towards crisis. So it's all there. Things we were looking at before. Yesterday when we were talking about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, is a tendency towards crisis, and profit rates at, sort of a larger scale level are some indicator of a tendency towards crisis. We can argue that this year or this coming year, when there's probably going to be some sort of financial trouble of one kind or another, that will, of course, be eased and a variety of other things done to sort of patch it together. But, bad things could occur. This is sort of, by 1978, Harvey had evolved an elaborate theoretical edifice in which to place the built environment, one which stemmed from a concern with how capital eluded inevitable crises of overaccumulation. His ideas firmly implanted in a Marxian theoretical frame, he sketched a model of capitalism that was focused on the circulation of capital through three circuits: a primary circuit in which are produced the means of production and consumption, Department 1 and 2, a secondary circuit of fixed asset and consumption fund formation, but primarily centered on the built environment, building boom, and a tertiary circuit involving social investment, such as education and health, as well as investments in science and technology. So we have all three of these things sort of operating at the same time. Currently, and with respect, when the new Trump administration comes in, they're going to be screwing with this in a variety of ways. One way is, of course, to kill the U.S. Department of Education, among other things. So you're going to see weird kinds of what ostensibly operates as an austerity measure. But anyway, focusing solely on the secondary circuit, David Harvey argued that capital will flow into that circuit as a result either of the efficient management of mediating financial institutions, really 2007, 2008, this prefigures that, or of crises in the sphere of production. The argument for capital switching deals mainly with the latter, although it does not exclude mediating influences. And so that's kind of where we are now. You kind of go through this entire, arm waving sort of thing. And you sort of see, at least in this 1994 paper, to what extent do these findings require a reinterpretation of Harvey's argument concerning the flow of capital into the secondary circuit during periods of overaccumulation in the primary circuit? And obviously, the analysis does not test directly his argument or assess it over a long enough time period. Probably it's a good time to do that now. Neither overaccumulation nor comparable rates of return are documented. The focus was the building boom that occurred between 1982 and 86, and only a portion, that is, construction investment of all real estate activity, is considered, though attention is given to mortgages and real estate loans. Nonetheless, the empirical relationships portrayed do provide an oblique view of the theorized phenomena and cannot be summarily dismissed. So, there's lots of fiddling around with the conclusion of that. And another article, much more contemporary article, Michael Eckers and Scott Brittam, the Y is a typo, of 2017, the metabolism of socio-ecological fixes, capital switching, spatial fixes, and the production of nature. We've heard the word fix used by David Harvey before and in other documents, and at least what Eckers and Prudhomme do is to identify what spatial fix might refer to. Note, of course, that we think about the contrast between things that are fixed and things that are sort of the difference between constant and variable and fixed and flexible or fluid. The spatial fix is Harvey's term for the ways in which response to these crisis tendencies occurs by means of some form of reset or fix with specific geographical characteristics. That's the whole point of Harvey's work, is to show that there's a kind of spatial or temporal extension that Marx, talks about, but is further explicated, particularly for, economic geographers. Harvey, 2001, explained that his choice of the word fix deliberately draws on the word's multiple connotations, including the following. That is, number one, to fix in place. Number two, the fixing of a problem by returning things to some functioning state, again with emphasis for Harvey on this taking a spatial form. Number three, a response to addiction, i.e. the user's fix, resolving an underlying craving or need whose specifically spatial resolution can only be temporary. Number four, a technological fix with emphasis on the spatial character of relatively large-scale technologies or technological systems. Number five, a spatial outlet for capitalist crisis tendencies through geographical expansion, resulting in the temporary fixing of the problem by means of opening up new spaces of commodity circulation and capital accumulations, globalization. And number six, a reference inspired by a close reading of, yes, Marx's Capital, Volume 2, and the Grundrisse, to the significance of enduring forms of capital investment that become embedded or fixed in the landscape and thereby immobilized or locked into place, infrastructure, in other words. And for Harvey, crisis acts as a irrational rationalizer. That's kind of, Donald Trump is an irrational rationalizer, resulting in distinct geographies of commodity circulation, capital accumulation, and social reproduction whose spatial arrangements work, at least temporarily, but in ways that result in an inherent tension between fixity and mobility. So all of these things that sort of have been going on for the couple of decades for David Harvey, talking about postmodernism, globalization, anti-capitalism, all that stuff represents a kind of tension between the kind of fixity in space and the fact is, globalization. Specifically, the locking in of spatial arrangements facilitates movement, but at the expense of sacrificing the mobility of that portion of the social capital locked into place. In addition, the process or rationalization for Harvey is expressed in some combination of two moments, an outer moment and the other inner. And this is Hegelian, and Harvey's, saying, well, I'm not much of a Hegelian. He's a Hegelian. These moments correspond respectively to extensive or expansionary tendencies and intensive or reorganizational and restructuring ones. So there's a whole thing about centralization and decentralization, and why is that important? The closing lecture of Higginbotham talks about the dependency theory, which at one level is a model about center-periphery relations, dependency relations, development issues, and of course the question of crisis, whether there is as it were, a rupture between inner and outer. Just the outer or decentralizing moment is perhaps more intuitive and familiar. Indeed, it is one of the central aspects of Hegel's formulation discussed earlier. The idea in simple terms is that the mismatch between supply and demand with any given territorially bounded and defined market might create pressure to expand spatially, to open new pathways for investment flows, and to open new markets for commodity sales. That's what was going on in financialization of the 2007-2008. Alternatively, falling rates of profitability as the result of increasing wages or rising prices for raw material inputs or escalating expenditures on fixed capital might propel an outward search for cheaper sources in new locations, like imperialism, right? Notably, expansionary or decentralizing tendencies might take place within nation states, resulting in decentralizing interregional reorganization or restructuring. Alternatively, decentralization might manifest itself internationally, opening up the possibility of capital flight from one nation state to another. That's what's happening when Trump threatens NAFTA and a bunch of other things, or the integration of some combination of national capital, commodity, and labor markets. And migration, issues about migration are also about labor markets. The inner or centralizing moment refers to spatial fixes that have a more in situ, that is in internalized or in place character, featuring some combination of efforts to deepen market capacity for absorbing investments and commodities within an existing regionally defined market, whether that be within nation states, regions, or cities. So all of those things are at work. We see it constantly redefined. We see it problematized, of course, in the relationship between the global North and South, and the issues of supply chain, all of those sort of things. So part of it is, of course, a key dynamic involves the investment of fixed capital into the built environment in ways that have the effects of, number one, absorbing surplus capital and thus relieving the pressure of overaccumulation, and number two, restructuring and improving the spatial infrastructure of commodity circulation and social reproduction. Needless to say, a counterintuitive move would be, although it's cynical, of course, Donald Trump saying that he agrees with the Longshoremen's Union that there should be less or no new automation in American ports in order to sort of accommodate or buy off one particular union, which he's trying to suck up to, but also seeing that creates actually a further complication in the supply chain because, you have in Asia, et cetera, more fully automated or more automated, highly automated port infrastructure. And so if there's going to be bottlenecks, it'll occur, of course, at the American level, which, it's not very efficient, but it certainly is more profitable. And you can see that's kind of Trump's whole deal is to, by exercising a certain type of isolationism, you get a certain kind of weird austerity move, which on the one hand squeezes the market. It's a kind of quasi austerity sort of move that also lines people's pockets because of its inefficiencies. It's sort of reinforcing inefficiency. This is the nature of Trumpian chaos, is to screw with these kinds of things, and or to use a different example, the $12 billion that was distributed in farm subsidies in the first Trump administration because he attempted to create a bilateral trade war at the agricultural level with China, which was a boon for Brazil and other places, but didn't do crap for, America. It just, well, some people walked away with money, but inequality remains. The inner moment of a fix thus entails both quantitative changes, that is, absorption of surpluses and the acceleration of production and circulation, and qualitative transformations, the development of new conditions, processes, and experience of production and reproduction. This second or centralizing moment of the spatial fix is arguably the more original of Harvey's insights. It has comprised the focus for significant development of the theory with emphasis on the relationship between capital investments and the production of specifically urban landscapes. It is clear, however, that although the two moments of spatial fix are usually discussed distinctly in Harvey's work, they are best understood as having a conjoined and relational character. And then there's an extensive thing on spatial fixes in the production of nature, which is more Neil Smith's thing. What Neil Smith does in his work on uneven development was to provide an integrated account of the production of space and the production of nature, the latter of which he viewed as the prior process. What Smith was doing was trying to emphasize a productionist sort of look at this. It was all about production, and it's a more orthodox, I would suppose, even though he was promoting the idea that the development is uneven. Specifically, he argued that the historical development of capitalism meant that space is no longer an accident of matter, but instead a direct result of material production. In other words, there's a metabolic relation between, the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene, whatever, to use a more modern term. Smith's theory is derived fundamentally from the aforementioned Marxian conception of a metabolism of human beings with nature. And this is the Bellamy-Foster position, remember, as the material foundation for social life and for historicizing distinct types of social formations. So we can see the entire development of a discourse on settler colonialism and a whole bunch of other things is all part of that. One of Marx's points of departure for historical materialism as a method for analysis was to consider the historically specific ways in which social reproduction has been secured through the deployment of social labor and then the transformation of biophysical nature. And so this all fits into a fairly conventional way in which we think about, how the world has been transformed. The concept of metabolism in this genealogy means that if the emergence of historically and geographically specific patterns of socio-natural change is tied to specific social formations, the converse is also true. It has reciprocity in that sense. Social and environmental change, seen as a single metabolism, are truly conjoined and can only be, quote unquote, thought together. In other words, the kind of barrier or boundary or differentiation between nature and culture or nature and humans or this difference of the Anthropocene or whatever is problematized. It's not transcendent in that sense. It is, interrelated. It's pretty clear that we're doing that when we decide to capture carbon. Let's put it that way. Those who would rightly emphasize the need to attend to the materiality of social life and specifically to the constitutive role of lively differentiated materialities in explaining trajectories of historical, geographical, social change will not miss you probably will miss the significance of this point. Moving from production in general to capitalist production, Smith argued that the defining feature of capitalism's particular metabolism is a shift from production for use to production for exchange. This is Department 1, Department 2. Put differently, the primary goal of capitalist production is the production of commodities or exchange values as ends unto themselves. This has far-reaching consequences in thinking about the capitalist production of nature for Smith, that is Neil Smith. Drawing from Marx, Smith argued that the production of exchange values by wage labor results in the collective alienation of working people from the products of their labor, including produced natures in various guises. Nature being here understood as a historical rather than transcendental category. So, we're going out there and getting raw materials. Nature is being transformed by our, for example, mining efforts. For Smith, it is this alienation that encourages, and in part, at least, a dualistic conception of nature seen as external to the social realm. That is, the nature-society dualism is, for Smith, Neil Smith, a historical product of capitalist accumulation as biophysical nature is increasingly transformed as and for exchange. So it's a 1980s concept in that particular context that growth is occurring, and it's problematized in its sort of the anthropocentric sort of ruthlessness or sort of the capacity to globalize. From this insight, Neil Smith, then reworks the concepts of first and second nature. Traditionally, first nature has been used to refer to pristine or prehistoric natural forms unadulterated by human action. That's kind of a 19th century view in many ways. In contrast, second nature has been used to refer to forms of nature that are historical products of social transformations, like clear-cutting forests, for example. For Smith, a notion of first nature outside of human histories and geographies, pure and pristine, made less and less sense with the development of global capitalism. Instead, he argued that capitalist production increasingly posits a qualitative shift such that as first nature needs to be understood as the set of concrete material natures produced as use values by capitalist labor processes, whereas second nature needs to be understood as commodified nature or as an exchange value, increasingly manifests as an abstracted notion of a fungible nature. You could call suburban development a certain type as this kind of second nature. or exurban growth as this kind of commodified nature. You could argue that Solano, the attempt to take over Solano County in California, is an attempt to commodify nature. That is, to create an ideal city from a sort of blank slate. It's a blank slate because it's just underdeveloped, but that's another story. And well, anyway, moreover, for Smith, with capitalist production, first nature comes to be produced through second nature. As specific transformations of material nature are guided by the imperatives of nature, it's an abstract, idealized exchange value. Now, you can drag this all the way back to the 19th century with the rise of, the simple examples are the emergence of, golf courses or cemeteries as not simply plots of land with graves, plots laid out in rows, in even rows, etc., but rather turned into, with all due respect, things that look like golf courses. That is, with meandering paths and gardens and a bunch of other things. Now that occurs in the late 19th century, and it is, part of 19th century America, blah, 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 blah. So there's a whole story there about the landscape that is replicated elsewhere. With this framework, Neil Smith self-consciously draws a parallel with Marx's conception of the role of abstract social labor in conditioning the production of surplus value from concrete or specific material labor processes in capitalist commodity production. You actually have to have people to do this. Now, there's a conclusion to this particular article, this more modern article, 2017. There's a kind of extrapolation of David Harvey's theorization of crisis-induced investments in the built environment via capital switching, arguing that sunk capital and fixed capital formation infrastructure need to be recognized explicitly as by which socio-natures are transformed and produced, and thus as forms of socio-ecological fixes. We have done this in part by drawing on Neil Smith's theory of the specifically capitalist production of nature. Finally, we have drawn on O'Connor's theory of the underproduction of nature, as well as feminist emphasis on the disjuncture between capitalist production and social reproduction. And with all due respect, you could even say that the attempt to restrict abortion is actually one of these kinds of things. And the inherently parasitic character of capital accumulation emphasizes the role of political contestation in shaping socio-ecological fixes. Our argument is in one sense general, that is, fixed capital and capital sunk into the consumption fund are always fundamentally metabolic processes involving the application of social labor to the transformation of socio-natures. So without getting too far afield, there's a lot of that going on. There's all kinds of stuff that is suggested. And the idea of cultural politics of consent and legitimacy suffuse the metabolism of capital switching and sunk capital. You can see that operative, for example, in Texas. So I'm close to the end of what I wanted to yammer about a little bit. Let me ask if there are any questions. What I wanted to do is because it only just came out, I don't know, I was looking for it last night and it still wasn't there, but it appeared magically today, this morning, I think, even though it's dated, it happened on the 9th of December. Andy Higginbottom's 10th lecture, the concluding lecture of Volume 2 of Capital, the Capital series. I assume he's going to do Volume 3, and I hope that he does it beginning in the spring, but who knows? I wanted to show a little bit of that. We'll come back to it. I just wanted to give you a taste of where he's ending up. It could be, in fact, that his emphasis on dependency theory is not simply to give us a sterling example of how Volume 2 applies. Marx's Volume 2 of Capital applies to more specifically his own research interests in Latin America and the Global South. But anyway, I wanted to give that sort of flavor of it. I don't know. Are there any pressing questions at the moment? Hearing none, I will begin this. I've set it at 1.25 speed, so we can cover more, but you can look it up. I put the link in the chat. It's on, I didn't put it on this page, but I will. So it is accessible. Can you hear this?
No.
No.
Yeah, but
the commodity derived last of the
let's start.
Okay, so this is the last of the lecture, and as you can see from the title, we'll be looking at how Marxist dependency theory used departments of production in volume 2. And there is an interesting link also if you look at the pricing, which wasn't my original intention, but it very helpfully came up when we were reading it, the role that we played in the development of these ideas. So that's the structure of what I'll cover. Pretty evident to leave that out. I did want to make a couple of comments on volume 2, part 3. This is really just a prompt as a reminder. So Marx looks at the totality of the capitalist mode of production from the perspective of the movement of commodity and commodities. And in very broad terms, the commodities are either those that are consumed in the capitalist production itself, or they're consumed by the workers, they have to buy them to live basically, or they're consumed by the capital. So what we've got here is three broad categories of how commodities are used, their use value. Now they're not down to the level of particular sectors. We're not talking about, we can exemplify with frozen peas and biscuits if you like for workers and private sector for capitalist consumption, but the categories themselves are quite broad. Okay, so we're talking like the category of all the things that the workers might consume to live and all the things that capitalists might use to produce more in the next round of production, if you like. Okay, so there's three broad categories. Now the issue here is that this is not just about the markets, it's about the way markets work to reproduce capitalist social relations in the capitalist mode of production. So what's particular about this is that the workers and the capitalists relate to each other from this perspective as buyers and sellers. But of course, because they're markets, it's not only about commodities, it's also about money, because there's always exchange. It's not quite, you can't have a market economy without the correlation between movement of money with the movement of commodities. So what is quite important if you look at the titles that Marx uses, he talks about the reproduction of capital through circulation, through the movement of money. Okay, now how this fits into Marx's overall design is it really is the bringing to a head the highest point, I think, in capital of the distinction between use values and exchange values. Because he's looking at how they interact on a social scale. So we're talking about circulation. We know in volume 1 he's looking very in the essence in production, in the essence in the production of surplus value. And what he's doing here is he's looking at circulation as it exists based on that platform which is already established. And what he's also doing in part 3 of volume is he's looking at the circulation based on categories of distinction that arise from the social relations of production. So of course, the most important one from volume 1 is the distinction between constant variable capital, and what he draws from the other parts of volume 2 is the distinction between fixed and circulating capital. So he's predicating the movement in circulation based on those. The interesting thing about this perspective of the totality is it's still, the perspective is that of industrial capital producing commodities, consuming commodities, reproducing itself. But what it also does is it shows how it's like the spontaneous movement of industrial capital generates within the system the requirement for a credit system as well. He's sort of in and out of credit systems quite a lot. So there's some points here about how to fit with volumes 1 and 3. So what we have is some resonance with the themes of volume 1, in particular the general accumulation, because we're talking about the totality of reproduction of class relations. But this level of analysis also has a limit, right, which does not apply here the degree of dynamic in the system, which he does do with general accumulation, which is this question of increasing productivity and the role that the rising organic composition capital has in driving the system forward. So I think this is quite an important point in terms of just locating how far must get to this mode of analysis and how much still needs to be sort of thought through. So what I think really is what you get with these departments of production is the possibility of crisis. There's disproportionalities, potentially, there's shortages, bottlenecks, and various points of instability. But it's still not a very strong and imperative necessity of the system as a whole to go into place. And so there's something else, there's something missing to it. And that's what something missing is why we need to study through the volume 3. So that's kind of just a summary of where we're at in terms of structure of technical. But just also go back to Rosa Luxemburg in the last lecture and her contribution. Her contribution was very significant politically. She was an outstanding opponent of the violence and then gave her life in that struggle. So it's important to remind ourselves, particularly what's happening in the world today, how she.
All righty. Well, I haven't cranked all the way up. Needless to say, there are issues. I've gotten to the end of my time, so we can return to other matters with writing coming up in an hour. I apologize for that. Probably do it again at some particular moment, perhaps with better audio. Let me thank you for your attention so far. And let me put up the links, etc. And also, are there any pressing questions before I cut the live